Andy, I encourage you to open them to Matthew chapter 16. Matthew chapter 16 is really where we're going to spend a lot of our time this morning. Last weekend I had the great opportunity to travel over to Indiana and visit the Church of Christ there in Anderson. Many of you probably know Josh Welch. Used to be a preacher that, I believe he used to preach at Laurel Canyon and a few other places, that he's over there now. So I got to spend the weekend with him and his family. And during my time there, I got to sit in during a study of Matthew chapter 16 in the first 12 verses. And a problem that I have sometimes when I'm reading, not necessarily just the Bible, but any book, because I really enjoy reading, is I'll get done with, say I read a whole chapter, and I'll get done with that chapter, and I'll close my book and then go, I don't remember what I read. Either that or I will remember what I read, but I might not comprehend it to what it really meant. So I can read a chapter of Matthew or Luke, and I go, I remember what Jesus said, but I guess I didn't really think that much about it and what it meant. And so it kind of good for me to sit through that lesson as we went verse through verse, me kind of looking at what Jesus means here. And so I wanted to dive into it a little bit more myself and study the first 12 verses of Matthew chapter 16. And I wanted to share that with you guys as well. So if you'd like to follow along, I'm going to begin reading in verse 1 of Matthew chapter 16. And the Pharisees and Sadducees came, and to test him, they asked him to show them a sign from heaven. He answered them, when it is evening, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning it will be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah. So he left them and departed. When the disciples reached the other side, they had forgotten to bring any bread. Jesus said to them, watch and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And they began discussing it among themselves, saying, we brought no bread. But Jesus, aware of this, said, O you of little faith, why are you discussing among yourselves the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive? Do you not remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000, and how many baskets you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000, and how many baskets you gathered? How is it that you fail to understand that I did not speak about bread? Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Then they understood that he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. I think it's very interesting when you dive in to these first 12 verses, what Jesus is really saying that is often overlooked. So we're going to kind of divide it into 4 different sections as we kind of study these 12 verses. So immediately as you enter into chapter 16, you notice something that is kind of uncommon, or you might find it a little bit strange. And it's the first thing that's mentioned in verse 1. And the Pharisees and Sadducees came. And this is strange when you consider the fact that the Pharisees and the Sadducees are not exactly friends, but rather are opponents of each other. You know, the Sadducees, interestingly, really only agree with the first 5 books of the Old Testament, that being Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And they also believe that once you were dead, that was it. There was really no afterlife. The only hope that you had was your legacy being passed through your nation, your family, and any traditions that you had on earth. And if God was going to bless you, he was going to bless you while you were on earth. Whereas the Pharisees had a larger following among the working class, they believed heavily in the oral traditions created by man. They were very big on traditions. They believed in angels and in demons, but they also had a very small view of God, where they elevated their traditions over God's word and scriptures, and viewed themselves as quite holy. As you can see, we've studied before, going to Luke chapter 15, where the Pharisees complain and kind of rebuke Jesus because he's eating dinner with this sinner. And they kind of see themselves as holy. They don't see themselves as sinners. But it's clear time and time again that the Pharisees really seem to think that God would be very impressed with them because they are so holy. But because of their differing ideologies, both religious groups who are hungry for power are at times bitter rivals. And so it's surprising when you jump into chapter 16 and you see that they are actually joining forces. So the verse goes on to say that they came to test him and asked him to show them a sign from heaven. And here's where we really see the real reason that the Pharisees and Sadducees are actually coming together. Because both held power within society and they were hungry for power and wanted more power, they saw Jesus as a common threat. Now I kind of thought about it like in sports. You say Donald, Randy, and myself we all root for 3 different teams. Now, me and Donald's teams are going to go to the playoffs if Randy's team loses. But me and Donald are arch rivals. We don't like each other. But we're both going to come together and root for each other because we want Randy to lose. We're both coming together as enemies because we have a common threat among us who we want to lose. And that's really the deal with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They both want to get rid of Jesus or disprove him in some way because he was a threat to their belief and a threat to their following as religious groups. And so it's the main reason we see that they are coming together. So Jesus goes on to say, when it is evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning it will be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. Jesus kind of speaks to a truth here in the weather side of things. You may have heard the saying before, red sky at night, sailors delight. Red sky in the morning, sailors take warning. And this is very accurate truth that Jesus is referring to, because, before the sailors had weather app on their phone, or you have the weather channel telling them that, hey, about 7:30 tomorrow morning, there's going to be a storm that could possibly arise. The best way to determine what the weather was going to be like that day or that night was to pay attention to the sky. If the sky was red at night, then it was going to be a night, it was going to be calm, not any storms, but if you saw red in the morning, then there was a storm coming. So the Pharisees and Sadducees ask for a sign, and Jesus is telling them how to determine the weather. I don't quite understand. Well, clearly Jesus is not really referring to the weather, but rather using it as an example to prove that these unbelievers are not really trying to clear any confusion up. They really just want to find anything that they possibly can to put Jesus down. So Jesus calls them out on it when he says, you cannot interpret the signs of the times. They asked Jesus for a sign from heaven, and what he pretty much tells them is, I've given you all the signs you need. You're not going to believe even if I give you another sign right here. If you walk through the book of Matthew with me, we'll find numerous miracles and signs that Jesus performs that proves to anybody who would have witnessed them or read about them that Jesus truly is as he says he is. He is the Son of God. He is the one who we should believe. He is the one who we should listen to and the one that we should follow. And just in the first 2 chapters of Matthew, you see the birth of Jesus, which is in and of itself miraculous and enough for us to recognize that Jesus is someone who is very special and someone who we should pay attention to. And then you get to chapter 3, and Jesus gets baptized, and immediately he went up from the water, and behold, the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and coming to rest on him. And behold, a voice from heaven said, this is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Another unmistakably clear sign to us that Jesus is the Son of God. A sign from heaven. You get to chapter 4. Jesus calls Peter, Andrew, James, and John. And as Jesus is going through Galilee teaching and preaching, we see in verse 23, he was teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction among the people. So here we go again, Jesus performing miracles. Every illness that these people have, he is healing. Every affliction they have, healing. You know, he's not some trained doctor who went to medical school and just happens to know that, oh, you need this medication and you're going to feel better. No, Jesus is miraculously healing these people's diseases. And then you skip to chapter 8. Chapter 5, 6, and 7 is the Sermon on the Mount. And you get to chapter 8, we see Jesus cleansing a man of leprosy. And then you read farther on in verse 16 that he cast out the spirits with the word and healed all who were sick. So here again we have Jesus healing different illnesses that people have. And even farther along in chapter 8, you'll see Jesus healing 2 men who were demon-possessed. And then you come into chapter 9, Jesus heals a paralytic. He brings a girl back from the dead, heals a woman, heals 2 blind men, and heals a mute man. And then even further on up to chapter 16, you see Jesus feeding the 5,000. Jesus walks on water. He heals more sick. He heals many by the Sea of Galilee, and he feeds the 4,000. And I'm sure there's probably even something that I've missed. But the miracles that Jesus has performed up to this point are many, and clearly proves to us who Jesus was. So what Jesus is really conveying to the Pharisees and the Sadducees is that he's given them plenty of signs, and it's clear that they're not going to believe him even if he performs another sign right in front of their faces. If you have not believed everything that you've already seen and witnessed and heard of, then who's to say you're going to believe just because I perform a sign right in front of you right now? Really, no matter what Jesus says or does, there are still going to be people who try and say that he is a fraud or that he is not the Son of God. So Jesus tells them, an evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah. To ignore all the signs that Jesus had performed and yet demand more is what Jesus is calling an evil and adulterous generation. And then, of course, he refers to the sign of Jonah, which many of us, I'm sure, probably know the story very well. Jonah tries to hide from God. Is up on a ship, and as the seas get rough, the ship is taking on water. They throw him overboard because he was the cause of this storm. Jonah gets swallowed by a great fish. And if you actually notice in Jonah chapter 1, in verse 17, and the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Jesus referring to the sign of Jonah is very significant because of the fact that Jonah spent 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish before being spit out. And so here Jesus is kind of referring to foreshadowing his death, burial, and resurrection, where he will spend 3 days and 3 nights before being raised up again. And that will be the sign that shows everybody that he is the Son of God. So the next step after Jesus departs from the Pharisees and the Sadducees is to continue teaching his disciples. Verse 5 there says, when the disciples reached the other side, they had forgotten to bring any bread. See, after dealing with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, as he's leaving, Jesus turns his attention to the disciples that were with him. However, his disciples had a lack of focus. They were worried about how they had forgotten to bring any bread along with the trip. They're worried about how they're going to be hungry. And their minds are not on what has just happened with Jesus and these religious leaders. And so Jesus sees this and he says to them, "Watch and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees." Jesus notices their lack of focus and calls them out by telling them to be aware of the leaven. You know, yeast or leaven was often used as a metaphor for evil. Not because it was unclean or inedible, but because yeast begins as a very small thing, growing larger and larger within the bread. A tiny amount of yeast, relatively speaking, can affect a large quantity of bread. And so Christ is giving a warning about how dangerous the errors of this religious leaders are, because following these ideas could lead to enormously wrong beliefs for the people. Given that they're thinking about the actual physical bread that they forgot, this is not the interpretation that the disciples first assumed. Verse 7 says, "And they began discussing it among themselves, saying, 'We brought no bread.'" They're still a little bit confused about what Jesus is saying. Jesus rebukes them after they realize that they had brought no bread on their trip. The thing is, though, Jesus is not rebuking them because of the lack of bread, but because of the lack of focus that we were just speaking on in the last point. At first glance, the disciples' response can be seen as almost comical. Jesus is dealing with these false teachers who are trying to hurt his reputation and somehow prove him wrong. Jesus shuts them down, they leave, and all of the disciples are worried about one of the most mundane things: food. Hey, nobody grabbed the bread. I'm hungry. So Jesus sees them, obviously rebuking them, but the disciples hear the word leaven, so they automatically go back to thinking Jesus is actually speaking about the bread. So they begin discussing among themselves how nobody grabbed it. Well, this is your fault. You didn't grab the bread. You were sitting by it. Jesus says, "O you of little faith, why are you discussing among yourselves the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive? Do you not remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many baskets you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many baskets you gathered? How is it that you fail to understand that I did not speak about bread? Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees." Jesus shows the disciples really what this is about. This is not about bread by any means. Jesus shows them by using the example of him feeding the 5,000 and feeding the 4,000, and showing that he has the capability of providing for their needs with little. Why are you worried that you have no bread? You know that I can supply nutrition for you. And when Jesus originally told them to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees, he was not simply saying that the bread in which the Pharisees and the Sadducees make is bad bread, and you should not buy it or eat it, but rather was telling his disciples to beware of the teachings of these two groups. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. As I mentioned just moments ago, the word leaven generally has a negative connotation to it in Scripture. If you look with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 5, if you would like to turn there. First Corinthians chapter 5, looking at verse 6. Paul says, "Your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Cleanse out the old leaven that you may be a new lump, as you really are unleavened. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Let us therefore celebrate the festival, not with the old leaven, the leaven of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth." There was a man at the church in Corinth who was guilty of sexual immorality, and people knew about it. It was a known thing. This was not secret. However, nobody had done anything to point out his sin or to separate him from the church. And so what Paul is telling the Christians in Corinth is that you can't let this stuff go on like that. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. When you make bread, all you need is just a little bit of yeast, and the bread will become much bigger than it ever would without the yeast. And the same thing is true with sin. As soon as one person can get away with sinning and nobody points it out, and nobody rebukes that one, and nobody tries to fix it, then more people are going to see that. You're like, well, he's a Christian. He's getting away with this. Nobody said anything, so it must be okay. And then you have multiple people. The sin is growing. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. The phrase is repeated by Paul in Galatians chapter 5 in verse 9. Little leaven leavens the whole lump. It's generally used in a negative way. Now, it has been used in a positive way. If you refer back to Matthew chapter 13, and in verse 33, he told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour till it was all leavened. Here, the word leaven is actually used in a positive manner, comparing the kingdom of heaven to leaven and how it grows. Showing us that we can be like the leaven when we spread God's word. We can help his kingdom grow. But the problem that Jesus is trying to share with his disciples, to be aware of it, and by listening to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, by listening to their ideas, by listening to their doctrines and their thoughts, those can start making their way into their minds and implementing themselves into their thoughts and their actions. It only takes one small little thought to make it into your mind, and that begins to grow and grow until you're no longer on the narrow way in which Jesus teaches them to be. Just like the man in Corinth. If there is a sin in the church and nobody does anything to confront it, then it has the capability to grow. And possibly more people will then be guilty of that sin. The leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees was very dangerous for the disciples because it truly could drag them away from the one that they had hope in. The hope in the gospel of Jesus Christ. So the question that I really want to ask is, what leaven should we be aware of today? Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Then they understood that he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. What leaven should we beware of today? While the Pharisees and the Sadducees are not exactly the groups in which we are dealing with in our everyday lives, there is still the same amount of truth in Jesus' teaching today as it had thousands of years ago. What doctrines are prevalent today that we need to be aware of? I just kind of picked 2 that, out of the many that I could have chosen, we could be here all day if we wanted to look at every single thing in our world that we have to be aware of. But one of those, it's very fast growing. You seem to hear more about it every single day, hear it on the news, and that is that of the, probably get the letters wrong, the LGBTQ community. There is so much around us that it's very difficult to avoid. Just about anywhere you go, someone is bound to get offended by how you refer to them. You're going to see men with men, women with women, men trying to be women or women trying to be men, and honestly, people trying to be whatever they think that they can be. There are even so-called churches out there that have started supporting the gays, the transgenders, and whatever may be out there. But what biblical authority do we have for that? I believe the Bible is unmistakably clear about the end result of homosexuality, sexual immorality, and everything that is off the track of what God commands and expects for us in our lives. We have to be aware of the leaven of people in these groups. We have to actively avoid getting drawn into accepting their practices and getting used to having them around, because the more we do, the more it will grow into our lives, and it no longer seems like that big of an issue. The second and final one that I just thought we'd mention too is the teaching of belief only. It is a very popular belief that all you need to do is believe in God and you will be saved. And you know what? That sounds very easy and very flattering, because that means that I can live like the world. I can love the world. I can chase any desire that I could possibly have. And as long as I believe that there is a God, then I'm going to be fine. However, that is far from the truth that we know is in the Bible. We have to be aware of the leaven of any false teaching. And we need to be aware of what God expects from us and what God demands for us if we desire to ever enter the kingdom of heaven one day. This goes on for so many doctrines, so many teachings and beliefs than just the two that I've mentioned. You can go through just about anything you see in the world, and the words of Jesus in Matthew chapter 16 are going to fit. What leaven do we need to be aware of today? Any false teachings that we allow in our lives will prove to be detrimental, as they have the ability to grow and ruin the good that we have developed. It's extremely important in our lives to always be focused on the Word of God and to be careful about what we put in our lives. What leaven do we need to watch out for? At this time, we're going to sing the song of invitation, and if there's anything that we can help you with, please make it known while we stand and sing.